my academic and professional background in both the soft and hard sciences, I was struck by Sullivan's book, Art Practice as Research, in which he suggests that art practice can be reframed as an academic research model. This is suggested as a solution to the lack of value given to visual art and art education in our society, and to the changes to institutions with the economic rationalisation of industry and information services in recent decades, due to which the allocation of funding is becoming increasingly linked to productivity demands, and visual arts departments and art education programs are increasingly required to justify what they do in terms of quantifiable outcomes. Sullivan goes so far as to ask what the equivalent practices in art are to the institutional conventions of science. However, the problem is not that art is not being understood as an intellectual research model, but that society only values such things which fall under this capitalist model of productivity and quantifiability. Through this, we are losing sight of the human in art and forgetting that creative work calls for a bodily and mental identification, empathy and compassion. Baudrillard writes of a kind of fatal strategy of conformity and the modern behaviour of the masses, who are also very good at complying with the models offered to them. In our case, the model is the academic format, which has been applied to artistic practice, and as in Baudrillard's description of hyper-reality and late-stage capitalism, there is the danger that the model will take the place of reality. To use another philosophical model, borrowing the terminology of Deleuze and Guattari, the inevitably hierarchical, reductive, tree-like model of the academic institution does not map onto the richly complex rhizomatic process of creating art. There was a time when art was trying to make reality play a game which was different to the game that art itself was playing. And now art is expected to play according to the rules of the academic and institutional model. This process has gone hand in hand with the rise of conceptual and intellectual art, which have housed the intellect and the eye but left the body and the other senses, as well as our memories, imagination and dreams, homeless. Ballasma also writes that contemporary architecture, posing as the avant-garde, is more often engaged with the architectural discourse itself and mapping the possible marginal territories of the art than responding to human existential questions, which applies equally to the visual arts. This is an apt description of the Hirsts and Kuntzes of the world, whose contribution to art is having ideas. They bring to mind William Blake's description of Sir Joshua Reynolds. This man was hired to depress art. Another thing Hirst and Kuntz have in common is that neither of them is physically involved in making art, instead paying other artists to produce their ideas. This is in stark contrast to the Heideggerian concept of handleability and practical knowledge, i.e. that we understand the world through our physical interactions with it. Ironically, in the current academic model, we write essays about how one learns through making and not through theory and thinking. Yet, there is undeniable value in artists learning about philosophical thinking and academic writing, if only to expand and clarify their own thinking, and to be able to express their ideas clearly. However, that applies equally to most humans. Philosophy is a tool for living, and formal academic writing is one means of communication. But this does not mean that they should be applied to art practice wholesale. Applying formal academic structures to one's own practice can be like dismantling a clock to find the tick. It may suit some artists, but should not be imposed. All of life can contribute to art. For example, women Kentridge and I are influenced as much, if not more, by writing and theatre than we are by other artists. Yet in university art degree courses, students are assessed on how well they research other artists and are not, as an arbitrary example, assigned to read a book of poetry each term. There is again the danger of the imposed model dictating practice, instead of practice arising from the artist's interaction with the world. Kentridge speaks of the necessity of utilising parts of one's brain which aren't the same as one's conscious planning and rational thoughts, while Ballasma suggests that in artistic works, existential understanding arises from our very encounter with the world and being in the world. It is not conceptualised or intellectualised. There is an unlimited, non-linear dialectic relationship between the artist and the world, which is the intelligence of the body. One must have, however, grant room for writing and research about art, which is a valid source of inquiry, just like history, for example. And just like history, art happens and is written about. But those participating in history do not write it, nor, one might argue, is it the artist's job to apply formal academic analysis to their own work. As artistic expression is engaged with pre-verbal meanings of the world, meanings that are incorporated and lived rather than simply intellectually understood. Does this mean that art has to be an irrational activity, simply letting yourself go? That is to posit a false dichotomy. Moving away from the intellect and reason does not equate to irrationality. In the words of Nietzsche, every artist knows how far from the feeling of letting himself go his natural condition is, the free ordering, placing, disposing, forming in the moment of inspiration, and how strictly and subtly he then obeys thousandfold laws which, precisely on account of their severity and definiteness, mock all formulation in concepts. Creating art is something for the sake of which it is worthwhile to live on earth, something transfigurative, refined, mad and divine, which is quite the opposite of formal academic endeavours. In my own work, an example of which is shown in Figure 1, I follow a bodily sensation, a synesthetic pang that says this feels right, this feels interesting, which guides me through the process of making, leading to often surprising outcomes. I do not seek an intellectual justification for what I do. Instead, I embrace a specific embodied mode of thought that takes place through the senses and the body. Kentridge argues similarly that art is not thinking through an idea, but instead embodying an idea in a physical material. In the example of drawing lesson 47, shown in Figure 2, which we are playing homage to here, Kentridge interviews himself about his life as an artist for the New York Studio School, taking what could otherwise have been a formal academic exercise and making art with it. He embraces chance and the absurd with, in his own words, an openness to recognize something as it happens. Kentridge describes his process as thinking through the body. Kentridge locates this bodily intelligence between one's shoulder and finger, while Ballasma suggests that the entire bodily and mental constitution of the maker becomes the site of the work. The latter is most accurate in my case. My body is a great intelligence, a multiplicity with the one sense, a war and a peace, a herd and a herdsman. I contain multitudes, and when I create art, these multitudes come together and into conflict, and a powerful identification and projection takes place between the work, the world, and my manifold self. As an artist-actor, for me the words of Nietzsche are particularly apt. You say I, and you are proud of this word, but greater than this is your body and its great intelligence, which does not say I, but performs I. Sullivan argues that existing misconceptions about the intellectual status of learning in visual arts means that the scholarly, cultural and social significance of art is grossly undervalued. In this case, the answer is not to intellectualize art practice, but to challenge the values that undermine art through an embodied art practice that embraces the rhizomatic and questions the authority of reason. Otherwise, there is the risk that art will become sterile and beauty will pass away from the land. As an artist, I will not reason and compare. My business is to create.